Thank you to the Power Institute, to the Terra Foundation, to Sydney Environment Institute for this great event and for bringing such fantastic international speakers to mix with us. The conveners, Alex, Sophie and Maggie, thank you very much. And Mark Ledbury, thank you so much for your rousing and fascinating introduction. The title of my paper is Mining Sydney Harbour, and I plan to discuss the making of Sydney Harbour as a symbolic, uncanny space when a coal mine was tunnelled under the harbour floor in 1897. To some extent, I'm arguing that the coal mine is symbolic of Australia's dark colonial history. The making of Sydney Harbour has been told many ways. Grace Karskens, who has written extensively on Sydney's early history, emphasises Aboriginal stories about powerful eruptions and magic, land deeply gouged and torn up, rising seas. Geologists, though, explain how 20,000 years ago Sydney Harbour was a vast and steep-sided valley until the end of the Ice Age 2,000 years ago, when water levels rose 120 metres and the valley was drowned. The making of Sydney Harbour can also be told through its industrial mining history. This is the way the story of Sydney Harbour was told in 1925 from the mining industry's point of view. Millions of years ago, the sites at present occupied by Sydney Harbour were covered with luxuriant forests. Then came an earthquake or some other tremendous cataclysm of nature. Sydney Harbour was suddenly placed on the map with a 7 feet thick coal seam underneath it. Coal was discovered in 1893 under Sydney Harbour. It put Sydney on the map as a global industrial energy source. In this intensely industrial period, coal was the substance that would change the world and make people rich. The Washington Post celebrated an enterprise with possibilities undreamed of for industrial and commercial gain. The British had settled in Sydney Harbour in 1788, and the colonial government in Australia claimed all lands for the Crown. This meant the Aboriginal clans of Sydney Harbour, who lived there for 60,000 years, were homeless and dispossessed. 100 years later, when the Crown gave permission to mine coal under the harbour, the British Observer newspaper described the issue of shares as one of the most important that has been recently offered to the British public from the British colonies. The British public was invited to subscribe to shares in the London-based company Sydney Harbour Collieries. Geologists predicted a lucrative seam of high-grade coal under the harbour. With no native title to protect Aboriginal communities, there was no negotiation with traditional owners. But fortunes were lost first when in 1906 the predicted immense bed of coal sought by the first shaft was revealed too thin for profitable working, and second when industrial disputes over working conditions forced the mine to close in 1931. Reflecting today on the link between modernity and industrial thinking and global warming and environmental crisis, the philosopher Michael Marder refers to the modern paradigm of the earth as an energy container, the epitome of what he calls the extractive, destructive attitude to the world, cast in terms of its depths, waiting to be breached, penetrated, and appropriated. This is the thinking that underpins the topic, Sydney Harbour's underwater coal mine. Imagine Sydney Harbour with the floor made visible, with the water that normally closes over it removed, making visible the inverted under terrain. This is the harbour revealed as an uncanny, ancient, alien wilderness in the heart of civilization. This picture, a contemporary photoshopped image, gives us an approximation of what people in the Victorian era imagined when they first heard that the black giant and black genie, as coal was then known, in other words, the black slave to industry, would soon be mined under the harbour floor. In 1897, a shaft was sunk under the floor of the harbour in the inner city suburb of Balmain, about 10 minutes' drive from where we sit today, and just past the harbour bridge in this view. The impact that the mine was to have was not just industrial or environmental, although these impacts were considerable. The idea of a submarine mine in the city centre also fired the public imagination. It sparked a colonial imaginary of fantasies about exploration and conquest that resonated with stories by Jules Verne, especially Journey to the Centre of the Earth, 1864, a story about subterranean exploration to unknown reaches of a prehistoric Earth, including the discovery of coal deep underground. And Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, 1898, a story like the Balmain coal mine story that revolves around the idea of the company, an imperial trading company, a notion of journey to the ends of the civilized world and the symbolisms of light and dark and blackness. Many citizens in the 1890s were excited that Sydney was the only capital city in the world that had a coal mine underneath it. The first discovery of coal in 1893 at Bradley's Head and Cremorne Point on the north shore of the city sparked an industrial euphoria. A coal mine would create jobs, employment, wealth. It would make Sydney the preeminent centre of Australia. But not everybody was happy. One of the leading artists of the day, Arthur Streeton, on the screen, objected to the mine at Bradley's Head and nearby Cremorne Point on the grounds of environmental impact. Mines would despoil our beautiful harbour, as Sydney was routinely called. The intended shaft of the mine was right where Streeton painted his legendary pastoral landscapes of Sydney, like the one on the screen, right where Streeton liked to immerse himself in the particularities of Australian light and colour. And as you can see in this image, the illusion of large, unpopulated expanses of land in the middle of the city. The Australian environmental philosopher Val Plumwood might describe Streeton's objection to the mine at Cremorne as a consumer-driven narrative of place. She argues it is one's privilege, power in the world that determines whose place is made better, whose worse. And Tim Bonyhady, in his book The Colonial Earth, argues that Streeton's motives in saving Cremorne Point from the coal mine were based on the fear of losing the cultural capital of his prime painting ground. For those who shared deep moral commitment to beauty over utility and aesthetics over profit, the aesthetic value of the harbour was beyond words. "We who live here," said one writer, "and have learned to know the harbour, nurse the thought of it as something too deep for words." Mark Twain arrived in Australia in 1895 in the middle of the public furore over whether to sink a coal mine at Cremorne or not. He got involved. He supported the artists and the environmentalists and praised what he called the superb, beautiful harbour, Sydney's great asset. For a time, the harbour's legendary beauty won out. The middle-class North Shore was saved the ugliness of a coal mine. But the Sydney Harbour Colliery Company obtained instead Crown land in the working-class industrial suburb of Balmain on the opposite side of the harbour. This is Balmain in the 1880s. Beauty and aesthetics had won the fight at Cremorne, yet by the late 19th century, Sydney Harbour's beauty had already been significantly modified by industry. Its stone cliffs excavated and blasted out of existence by explosives, beaches removed, walls and landfill added to expand the land into the sea and serve industry and shipping. This photograph of Balmain was taken before the coal mine was built on the foreshore. In the distance are the harbour's natural rock formations tumbling into the water. Visit the site today and you will not find those rocks. You will instead see reclaimed land. You will find scarred cliff faces, the type of human-impacted, altered landscape that social anthropologist in Australia, Dennis Burns, sees as indicators of the acceleration of the Anthropocene. This photograph was taken standing in Balmain at Elkington Park, one of the largest shell middens on Sydney Harbour, the remains of the lives of an Aboriginal clan who camped there for thousands of years, eating the oysters you see on the rocks. According to Mary Salmon, when Aboriginal groups lived in the area in the early 19th century, the elongated peninsula known as East and West Balmain was the chief hunting ground for kangaroos and wallabies. Natives held corroborees, she said, and fish from the rocks, and the flat beaches were loaded with mussels and winkles. But in 1897, close to where the white apartment building is standing on the far left of the picture, the machines that operated Australia's deepest coal mine appeared. Known as the Birthday Shaft, it was drilled 3,000 feet, or close to 1 kilometre, beneath Sydney's bedrock, and a tunnel dug at right angles under the harbour towards Cremorne Point on the north shore, under what is now the Harbour Bridge. Unlike the residents of Cremorne Point or Bradley's Point on the north shore where the mine was originally planned, the residents of the low socio-economic suburb of Balmain welcomed the mine for jobs. Balmain was already blackened and sooty with industry, the antithesis of the pastoral landscapes of Cremorne to the north. Balmain was what Val Plumwood calls the shadow place. She writes, how nice north places and shadow south places are related, especially where north places are nice precisely because south places are not so nice. In this postcard we see grimy working class Balmain and the anthropomorphic mining machine looking north to more verdant shores. The birthday mine shaft was so named to commemorate the birthday of Queen Victoria, which fell on the day when the first explosives were detonated to create the mine. The coal mine was beneath the water. No idea was more uncanny than a tunnel filled with miners under the floor of the harbour. Above the water, Sydney, at the height of the industrial age, was one big coal-fuelled city, pumping out greenhouse gases and dangerous levels of air pollution. The artist Tom Roberts, a close friend of Arthur Streeton, whose wife reputedly owned shares in the Sydney Harbour Colliery, was, like thousands of artists, including Claude Monet, attracted to industrial atmospheric effects. Think of Monet's paintings of smoggy London and the interplay between changing light conditions and the air pollutants derived from open coal burning. Other Australian artists who were also seduced by the atmospheric combination of steam, smoke and sunshine was the pictorialist Harold Casno. His photographs of Sydney Harbour and coal steamers also capture the Anthropocene as it began to accelerate. The title of Casno's photograph, Silver and Grey, signals his commitment to the right for aesthetics to remain a realm autonomous from the politics of the everyday. In 1908, the harbour was pronounced reeking with filth. The air was thick with coal smoke from steamers and mining. Coal and coal dust were dropped daily into embayments from the colliers. It was the same in other modern ports. In Genoa in 1901, the artist Paul Klee described gigantic steamers from the wide globe, the smell of oil, human bodies black with coal, the disgusting water, from his Italian diary. The underwater of Sydney Harbour, especially at Glebe Island, just down the road from here, and at Longnose Point near Balmain, was full of sharks following blood and offal from abattoirs and sewer effluent. Raw sewage flowed directly into the harbour until 1898. The late 19th century saw an acceleration in the number of popular press images showing sharks attacking and menacing people in the harbour. In the distance is the suburb of Balmain before the coal mine. In 1908, Sydney siders were warned that the harbour would soon be as polluted as Havana, Cuba. In fact, Ian Hoskins, who's written a history of Sydney Harbour, has noted the similarity between the Australian illustration of a shark attacking a boat and John Singleton Copley's painting of a shark attack in Havana. So I guess he saw in this Australian illustration a type of kitsch version of the masterpiece. When a diver working at the mouth of a sewer leading into Sydney Harbour was circled by a shark in 1876, an illustrated newspaper report explained how it must have been a picture such as never occurred to the wild imagination of Jules Verne. Indeed, the illustrations of the diver and shark in Sydney Harbour had some similarities to an illustration in Jules Verne's early edition of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. There it is. Here's another interpretation of the shark and diver in combat under Sydney Harbour. The monstrous, maniacal apparition of the shark, well, can be actually looked at in lots of ways, embodies the idea that was current at the time that the floor of the harbour was the opposite of modern life on land. It was a place of devolution and a frontier to conquer. The thought of another world under the surface of the harbour was unsettling and uncanny. And the thought of a coal mine with workers below the floor of the harbour, beneath the crust, separating the ocean from the centre of the earth, was doubly uncanny. It captured the public imagination to think how workers in the coal tunnels could hear ship anchors bumping on the ocean floor above. To think of ships sailing and sharks swimming invisible over the heads of coal miners. It was something from Jules Verne, and people started to link the Under Harbour coal mine with science fiction and Verne's book, Journey to the Centre of the Earth. In Verne's story, the two protagonists follow a volcano vent to the centre of the Earth and discover a tunnel lined with coal. Timothy Unwin describes Verne's story as a journey to prehistory, as the travellers go downwards through the Earth's crust and backwards in time to the evidence of ever earlier stages of the evolutionary process. Verne's text reads, "On these dark walls was written the whole history of the coal period. When the birthday mine at Balmain was tunnelled under the floor of the harbour, it felt as if Jules Verne had been brought to life. Newspapers were explicit about the Vernian nature of the coal mine, even suggesting that Jules Verne had enabled it to happen. In 1907, it was claimed that the idea of being able to descend 3,000 feet under the harbour, even without Jules Verne's boat, makes one wonder if that powerful writer had a more than ordinary foresight." But like the underground abyss in Verne's story, there was a feeling that something disturbing and unwelcome might return from below the Earth's crust. The Under Harbour coal mine was a psychological force. A type of low-key coal mine tourism began to develop, organised by the Sydney Harbour Colliery Company. After 1901, when 5 miners were sent hurtling 400 feet to their deaths, the company needed positive publicity to counter the growing industrial unrest. For instance, on one occasion, the Sydney Harmonic Male Voice Choir was invited to descend the Balmain mine to broadcast their singing live on radio. They wanted to prove, they said, that men hidden in the very bowels of the earth could make their voices heard all over the continent. Symbolically, it showed that humankind in the Western world had taken control of every corner of the earth. A newspaper headline about the broadcast from the mine read, "Jules Verne outdone." The report read, "Jules Verne, in his descent to the middle of the earth, could not have conceived anything more bizarre than the experience of the party." Bizarre, yes, and also horrific. The mouths of the singers filled with coal dust. They were choked by heat, and they were desperate to get out. Some who descended 3,000 feet found a type of horror. Many of the miners worked 8 hours a day without ever straightening their backs. They worked soaked in water. Many were burnt by gas explosions. Some died in preventable accidents. The air was hot and bad. Miners developed boils, rheumatism, skin diseases. When 5 men were thrown to their deaths, and the verdict was accidental death, one conclusion reached was, there is no security for human life. They formed a union to fight the company. In 1905, they walked off the job. When the mine was forced to close in 1931, the company said it had been literally strangled by the miners. One newspaper article described in 1899 a descent into the pitch darkness of a coal mine, where miners were more like gnomes than men, lying down on their sides inside the cleft from which they are excavating the coal, some of them buried far in the dim recesses of the hollowed-out cavity which they have formed. It was as if the miners had gone backwards in time, descending from the light of reason and knowledge through layers of time to a darkness that shaped them differently as subhuman. Written in the same year as the first publication in serial form of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the description of journeying through pitch darkness and finding coal miners buried in the earth like gnomes working in a submarine landscape of potential menace surrounded with the blackness of coal resonates with Joseph Conrad's story. Heart of Darkness, of journeying in pitch darkness up a river into the heart of Africa, where readers are introduced to what Peter Virchow describes as a dark, irrational, timeless place populated by a dehumanized race of savages. Throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, many writers tried to depict the psychological geography of coal mines. In the early 20th century, there are explicit references to Conrad in the way the descent to the mine is described as a descent into, quotes, the heart of darkness. With the Balmain mine, the binary of light and darkness dominates descriptions. One writer described being hurled from the sunshine and the highways of men deep down into the eternal silence and the haunting darkness of the inner world. Not until much later in the 20th century did coal mining companies begin to take responsibility for chest complaints and bronchitis resulting from fumes, gas and bad air. Not until social realism in the 1940s in Australia did images of coal miners show the bodily impact of silicosis, as you can see in this fantastic print by Noel Counihan. Val Plumwood's concept of shadow spaces contributes interestingly here. The dualisms that make nature other to culture and the material earth a resource and an object to mine also, she says, deny and devalue the sphere of the body, nature, labour and matter. Conclusion. Where once settlers had arrived in Sydney by sailing over the surface of the harbour, in 1893 their urge to tunnel under the harbour was symbolic of a sense of entitlement, to excavate, explode, reshape, extract and tame the otherness of wilderness. If the story of the Balmain coal mine seems familiar, as I'm sure it probably does, to many people here, it's because it embodies the familiar cultural narratives of Western civilization entering the empty wilderness and transforming and reshaping it through rationality and order. Aboriginal people are mostly absent in the historical records that inform the story I've relayed here. Yet Aboriginal presence is implicit everywhere in the binary of light and darkness, a binary that Daphne Ernest Vulcan, writing about Joseph Conrad, argues is the underlying foundation of colonial rhetoric. Aboriginal presence is there through the white judgment that Indigenous people belong to the darkness of the past, like the wilderness of the floor and underfloor of Sydney Harbour. They are there in the racialised idea of coal as a black giant and a black genie from a prehistoric past, a black slave for European progress. Indeed, concepts of wilderness, conquest and extraction are interlinked with race in a way that relates directly to Ghassan Haj's argument that ecological struggles and racial struggles unfold together in history. They are fundamentally linked through a Western disposition to dominate and exploit the other. The history of the management of the London-based Sydney Harbour Colliery is just one example of the Western narrative of the great cause of progress in unmapped territories, in dark places of the earth, also found in Jules Verne, also found in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. In Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where the agents of the company think of themselves, as Ernest Vulcan argues, as emissaries of light in shadowy lands conceived in colonial terms as primitive. Thank you.
I'd like to start with an apology. I'm not an art historian, but I'm also not a Visigoth, a visual Visigoth. I normally try to introduce my talks with a small film. I have made a film about this subject, but it takes too long, so I'm going to just talk to you today. Well, between 1965 and 1975, the Australian poet Judith Wright led a successful popular political war to save the Great Barrier Reef from the Queensland state government, who had instilled a campaign to mine 80% of it for oil, gas, fertiliser and cement. In conjunction with that, they also launched a campaign to drive, to in effect level adjacent reef rainforests in order to create a sugar industry. 2 decades later, Judith Wright ended the anniversary edition of her famous book, Coral Battlefield, with a chapter called Finale Without an Ending. She warned that politicians were fickle and renewed attempts to mine the reef region could resume any time. And so they have. But with this new reef war, the stakes are absolute. Thanks to man-made atmospheric CO2, mass coral bleaching and ocean acidification threaten the total annihilation of 2,300 kilometres of coral, one of the most beautiful natural sites on the globe and a crucial hub of Indo-Pacific ocean biodiversity. In this short paper, I want first to tell the story of how Wright's small community coalition helped win the first reef war, and to reflect briefly on what lessons that victory offers today for environmental arts and humanities scholars who are fighting for the life of the Great Barrier Reef. Well, the war had opened with a skirmish. Midway through 1965, Judith Wright, president of a small community wildlife preservation society of Queensland, received a plea for help from an artist, John Buist, who led a very tiny local chapter of the society at Mission Beach in the central section of the Great Barrier Reef. His region was experiencing rapid deforestation to enable sugar plantations, and a local sugarcane farmer had just made a formal application to the state government to mine the so-called dead local Ellison Reef for cheap limestone fertiliser. John lodged an objection, pointing out that like all coral reefs, Ellison comprised living corals on the top and vast buttresses created from below from dead coral skeletons. However, the mining warden's court rejected these arguments on the grounds that Buist lacked scientific qualifications. Squeaking an adjournment, he sought help from scientists at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, but they proved both scarce and unwilling to involve themselves in politics. Australian scientists actually knew very little about this remarkable, massive ecosystem, which encompasses 350,000 square kilometres of coral reef, lagoon, 3,000 islands and coastline. An area larger than England and Ireland put together, a country rather than a reef, really. The first full-time researcher on the reef, Dr. Charlie Veron, was appointed only in 1972, when this reef war was almost over. Anyway, versatile Judith Wright managed to find a handful of zoology students who agreed to undertake an underwater survey of Ellison Reef, provided that John funded their travel. And when the court eventually resumed almost 2 years later, the student divers reported having seen 190 species of fish and 88 species of living coral on Ellison, and it's still a living reef. I dived on it recently. This combined with the testimony of a scientist who'd worked there some years earlier, forced the warden into recommending against mining, though it had already begun. There's a huge swathe cut through the reef already. This small victory unleashed a full-scale war because it goaded the Queensland government into public action. The Country Party, already in power in Queensland for a decade, had decided in 1963 that the discovery of oil on the reef could prove to be the state's nirvana. And they'd secretly begun oil exploration. In 1967, a crafty populist and champion of unbridled development, Joh Bjelke-Petersen, became premier, and he promptly zoned 80% of the reef for oil and gas exploration. He and his ministers also made large secret investments in 6 global oil companies. Bjelke-Petersen's rhetorical style will be all too familiar today. He liked to abuse Judith Wright's supporters as flower-sniffing fools, nitwits, cranks, ratbags, and commies intent on overthrowing the Australian way of life. In May 1968, Bjelke-Petersen appointed Dr. Harry Ladd, an American geologist with extensive mining links, to justify his oil mission. Ladd spent a week flying with the Premier's mining officials over the 2,300 kilometres of coral. He found promising oil prospects, and he recommended mining non-living reefs for fertiliser and cement manufacture. This was akin, responded Judith Wright, to pulling down the Taj Mahal to make road gravel. Judith had fallen in love with the Great Barrier Reef in 1949 while staying at its southernmost tip, Lady Elliot Island. Shocked by the scars of guano mining, which was the first great mining of the reef, she nevertheless was absolutely smitten by the beauties of the island's fringing coral reefs. Thereafter, corals became, for Judith, a metaphor to describe lone individuals who dared to build vast bastions of moral resistance against oceanic political forces. They were like tiny coral polyps, builders. Only those coral insects live that work and endure under the breaker's cold, continual thunder. They are the quick of the reef that rots and crumbles in calmer waters. Only those men survive who dare to hold their love against the world, who dare to live in doubt what they are told. They are the quick of life. When Judith founded the Queensland Wildlife Society in the early 1960s, one of the earliest members was a Brisbane forest scientist, Dr. Len Webb. He was just such a builder. His mother had been a shearer's cook, his father a horsebreaker, and he'd gained his scientific education at night school. After taking a wartime job in a munitions factory, the army then funded him to study biochemistry, which in turn led to a life-changing job surveying Queensland's rainforests for medically useful plants to support the war effort. With so many plants to study, Len learnt from Aborigines, timber workers and tin scrapers how to test for alkaloids on his tongue rather than sending them off for chemical analysis. Many of these loners also shared his passion for what he called the mystery and sacred beauty of the rainforests. He recounted how he'd one day been overwhelmed without feeling claustrophobic or afraid by the complex terrestrial system. It was like being infused, he said, with soul, heart, or spirit. Henceforth, he'd vowed to defend these sublime forests that dated back to Gondwanaland from all human predators. He then completed one of Australia's first PhDs in ecology and been employed by the CSIRO to map all of Australia's mainland rainforest systems. The Reef Island artist John Buist had first met Len after sending him a local plant with medicinal properties. Despite their different backgrounds, they became instant friends through a common love of Tennyson's poetry, Wagner's music, and the euphoric properties of ethyl alcohol. John Buist had been born into a wealthy mining family, ironically enough, and studied law at Melbourne University alongside his best friend Harold Holt. The latter would become Liberal Party Prime Minister, while John dropped out instead to become a painter and a craftsman in adobe, wood and stone at the Art and Crafts Colony outside Melbourne, Montsalvat. In 1940, a family bequest enabled him and his wife Alison to buy land on Badara Island on the Great Barrier Reef, where they lived a carefree bohemian life for 17 years, building a mud brick house, laying out a tropical garden, selling the odd painting, and gaining a passion for local bird life. Development on the island drove the Buists in 1956 to design and build a cyclone-proof bungalow, the first in Australia, among the rainforests of Bingle Bay on the opposite mainland. When they moved in, however, they discovered that the army had just co-opted the adjacent forest for exercises in defoliant bombing with Agent Orange. Len Webb immediately volunteered to teach them the ecological principles needed to fight this takeover. Fired with a fresh conservationist passion, John began campaigning throughout the region to protect rainforests, rivers and reefs, habitats from developers and army bombers. This trio of poet, painter and forester quickly became, Judith said, welded in a very deep companionship that was both intellectual and emotional. They combined their expertise to disseminate scores of books, textbooks, newspaper articles, lectures, personal letters, popular talks, and so on. These linked the principles of holistic ecology with the creative values and power of art, language, aesthetics, and imagination. Len's popular ecological writings stressed that humans needed to interact with non-human fauna and flora, such as fish, turtles, corals, and trees, using both their rational and their emotional intelligences. Drawing on Judith's poems, he argued that we need a new word to convey that feeling of deep engagement and wonder, that feeling of privilege in witnessing the life of wild animals and birds and in moving amongst wild scenery. Judith Wright, for her part, diversified her talents to write influential popular articles like her famous piece, Conservation as a Concept, which hailed the emergence of a hopeful new science of ecology in the human as well as biological fields. This promised, she wrote, to bridge Western civilization's most tragic divide by providing a point at which a new spark can jump across the gap that at present separates the arts and the sciences to the great detriment of each, and allow a new kind of cooperation and understanding to grow up. Well, John Buist used his organisational acumen and vernacular talents to bombard newspapers like The Australian, owned by Murdoch, with a stream of fiery articles warning that the reef was soon destined to become a quarry surrounded by an oil slick. He also proved to be a master lobbyist who harassed his friend Prime Minister Holt into agreeing to test Queensland's claim to sovereignty of the reef with a case in the High Court. When Harold Holt died while diving in 1967, Buist then tracked down the new Liberal Party Prime Minister and the opposition Labor Party leader while they were holidaying on the reef and persuaded them to fund a federal reef research station, the first, and to launch a cross-party Royal Commission of Inquiry into reef oil and gas mining. Finally, he began urging trade unions to instigate black bans on oil companies seeking to drill the reef. In January 1970, this tactic succeeded in forcing the JPEX and Ampol petroleum companies to cancel their proposed drilling at Repulse Bay. Now, at last, the breakthrough has come, Buist exulted. It has taken 2.5 years to find the weapon. Well, the trio's publicity also prepared Australians for a watershed moment in late January 1969, when an oil rig started spewing crude oil into the beautiful waters of Santa Barbara on California's coast. Australian TV news showed infernos of rotting fish, oil-clogged seabirds, and viscous black beaches. Bjelke-Petersen's bleats that this couldn't happen in Queensland rang hollow when an oil tanker soon after struck a reef on the Great Barrier Reef and leaked its toxic cargo into the reef lagoon. The Queensland Minister for Mines, Ronald Cam, tried in vain to persuade Queenslanders that oil, being protein, would actually nourish the fish and other marine organisms. I tell you, it's absolutely true. By the early 1970s, polls were showing that a majority of Queenslanders now opposed mining of the Great Barrier Reef. At this point, the war was effectively won. The election of the Whitlam Labor government in 1972, the Royal Commission's report on oil drilling, and the High Court's decision in favour of Commonwealth sovereignty all paved the way for a political settlement. Both sides of federal parliament agreed in June 1975 to establish a multi-use Barrier Reef Marine Park under shared federal and Queensland management. 6 years later, this gained World Heritage listing as the most impressive marine area in the world, an opinion often echoed by David Attenborough. Of course, much has changed in the 43 years since this victory. For a start, there's not the same deficit of scientific expertise that hampered the trio's advocacy. The reef now boasts 4 marine research stations led by world-renowned coral reef scientists. Yet paradoxically, it's the very excellence of reef science that inspires today's political campaigns of obfuscation and opposition. Vested commercial and political interests decry science research as mere opinion based on bias and self-interest. Climate change scepticism now powers populist right-wing political movements throughout the West, including Australia. Talkback radio jocks, Murdoch journalists and coral-caressing party politicians endlessly chirp the job-creating virtues of coal mining. Scientific methodologies also exclude today's professional marine scientists from deploying a range of powerful social, cultural and economic arguments in defence of the reef. Len Webb's blend of scientific and poetic ecology that extolled indigenous spiritual custodianship and the aesthetic, visual and sensual importance of the reef is out of bounds for today's scientists. Instead, they must rely on us in the environmentally oriented humanities, arts and social sciences to make these arguments. And we are doing so, at least trying to do so. We're collaborating with eco-tourist industries whose livelihoods depend on the beauty, health and wonder of reef corals and who attract thousands and thousands of national and international visitors each year to enjoy the pleasures of recreational swimming, boating, fishing and snorkeling. The reef actually employs, as a result of this, 75,000 jobs. Like Wright & Co., we too are undertaking cross-disciplinary collaborations of the arts and sciences to halt the potentially lethal operations of the Adani Carmichael coal mine. Stopping Adani could be our symbolic equivalent of the Ellison Reef victory of 1965, as well as a potent means of reducing the lethal local and global threats to the reef's survival. The Adani Group is a huge global conglomerate with a disturbingly bad record of environmental violations in Africa, Latin America and India. It's also already violated in Australia. It was approved in June 2017 to mine 60 million tonnes of thermal coal per annum from the Galilee Basin for the next 60 years, amounting to a total of 2.3 billion tonnes of coal. One coal mine. At peak production, 85,000 container ships per annum will travel through the shallow, fragile reef lagoon. This will mean major and continual dredging of lagoon seabeds, with the resulting asphyxiation of corals over hundreds of kilometres, including Sydney's adjacent and still pristine One Tree Island Research Station. Dredging will also destroy seagrass meadows essential to dugong and will churn up vimobacteria responsible for deadly white spot coral disease. The output of this single Carmichael mine also threatens to generate greenhouse gas emissions on a global scale. By releasing 120 million tonnes of CO2 per annum into the atmosphere, which is an amount greater than the current annual emissions of over 100 individual countries. Adani will emit more than 4.6 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide over its lifetime. Alone, it will use up 1/10 of the world's total carbon budget and absolutely ensure that we exceed the fatal warming level of 2 degrees Celsius. To combat a global conglomerate like Adani, we need also to work with global conservation organisations such as Future Earth, 350.org, Get Up, the Ocean Conservation Foundation, Greenpeace, Reef Ecologic and the Pew Foundations. Our Sydney Environmental Institute, multidisciplinary institute, now actively engages, unashamedly engages with all these organisations in public events, workshops and collaborative research grants. Now that the Australian Research Council requires us to demonstrate our engagement and impact beyond the university, there surely could be no better time for the environmental arts and humanities to emulate the poet, the painter and the forester by demonstrating the true power, our true power and worth. Thank you very much.
So we had two rich and powerful narratives. Thank you, Ian and Anne. I think together they present to us a history of a torn Australian environmental ethos, especially towards the elemental conjunction of water and rock, or of coral bone, and what this conjunction might stand for symbolically. By way of response from my anthropological perspective on human imagination and materiality, I wish to make three propositions. One, Australians unconsciously harbour a sacrificial self-image that puts little restraint on forsaking and destroying human and non-human bodies and environments. Two, the work of art and of labour need to be reconciled with each other if a new viable cultural imaginary of Down Under is to be forged. Three, art and imagination are indispensable mobilizers, but they are not intrinsically benign. All three propositions have to do with what, in the most general terms, might be called a relationship between subject and object, those building blocks of worlds that anthropologists dig around in. The struggle of non-Indigenous Australians to belong to this land and its surrounding seas can be couched in these terms. To overdraw the picture, and leaving out especially the complex position of farmers, nature features either as lifeless object, as resource property, dumping ground for toxic waste, military zone or wasteland, or as human devouring, terrorizing subject. To elaborate on my first proposition, Mother Nature has not been kind to many a first explorer who perished in the so-called bush. And Australian literature and popular culture abound with eerie calls for human sacrifice that seem to emanate from rocks, as in Joan Lindsay's 1967 novel Picnic at Hanging Rock, or as in the 1980 Azaria Chamberlain case that happened at Uluru when her baby was taken by a dingo and dematerialised. In her 1961 essay, The Upside Down Hut, Judith Wright explains these deaths by landscape in cultural terms. Just a few lines from her poem. All these dead men in our literature then, a kind of ritual sacrifice? And just what is being sacrificed? Is it perhaps the European consciousness, dominating, puritanical, analytical, that D.H. Lawrence saw as negated by this landscape? Reconciliation, then, is a matter of death, the death of the European mind, its absorption into the soil it has struggled against. Jungian literary scholar David Tacey observes in his book Edge of the Sacred, 1995, that Wright was among the first to see the following pattern. Unable to connect to the genos loci, the spirit of place, conquerors of the land are themselves eventually conquered by the land. She says, we cannot psychically and physically abuse nature on a grand scale and then expect it to nurture and protect us. How then can art help bridge the abyss that continues to disconnect so many non-Indigenous Australians from their environment? How can the settler colonial image of the land and waterscape as foe be overcome? How to nurture a self-image other than Quarry Australia? Where I work in Central Australia with the traditional owners, the Anangu of Uluru, another centre of the world and that had emerged from an ancient sea, human bodies and minds are consubstantial with earth, water, non-human life. Rather than a subject-object relationship, this is an ontology firmly grounded in subject-subject relationships within and beyond the human realm. Everything is a trace of ancestral action. Human symbolic productions intertwine with these traces now and into the future, so that nocturnal dreaming, naming people and places, singing, painting, dancing, drawing in the sand, sculpting the earth, and initiating boys and girls into full, proper human beings, all make manifest the interconnection between the human and the non-human, matter and value, inner and outer reality. This is true for artistic thought elsewhere. The British poet Randolph Stowe, in a commissioned piece from 1961 about the Australian environment, which he entitled Raw Material, observed that both in art and its entity, and in this entity called the environment, subject and object are indivisibly linked. As he writes, the boundary between an individual and his environment is not his skin. The environment of a writer is as much inside him as in what he observes. External forms are filtered back through the conscious and unconscious mind. In that sense, the world out there is raw material. Indigenous and a European artistic imagination connect here, but what of the workers? To elaborate my second proposition very briefly, namely that there is a need to reconcile art and work in order to create meaningful lives. Bending his back for hours on end beneath the ocean floor, breathing with difficulty in 40 degrees heat, I'm sure that for the Balmain coal miner too, the boundary between himself and the environment was not his skin. So what of his imagination? What kind of raw material was the world for him and he for the world? I might need my slides now, so thank you. And on that basis, what kind of transformation could his hard yakka bring about? How to shift from being an excavator to becoming a builder, in Judith Wright's terms that Ian used. So if I could show you these two images from Germany's former black coal mining region, the Ruhr area where I grew up. Rather than the symbolic death that Anne showed us was associated with the descent into the prehistoric realm of carbonated trees under Sydney Harbour, these two men, it seems to me, are in a heroic rather than gnome-like posture, and they appear proud and intimately engaged as they affectionately bear the fruits of the earth, as if giving birth to a child. A different rite of passage is indicated here, one that points beyond sacrifice towards creative transformation in and through work. But still, sacrifice it was. As is well known, the process of extraction, of bringing forth the black gold, made breathing difficult and dangerous. About this extreme case of a petrified lung, now an exhibit in the UNESCO World Heritage listed mining museum in Essen, one could say, he has effected a malignant consubstantial relationship between subject and object. This is why some whose working lives are now on display in industrial museums praise the end of coal in the Ruhr this year. Others, however, struggle to feel at home in the gentrifying landscape of the new era. They are feeling left out of the creative transformation of the entire region into a restored garden or parkland. How then, so my larger question, can art and work forge an alliance that is creative and not destructive, and that moves beyond battles, victories, and losses towards repair and renewal of life within and beyond the human realm? To conclude on my third proposition briefly, Ian has very convincingly argued for the necessity of art to save the reef. But the images of the floor of Sydney Harbour and surrounds as a prehistoric nightmare, colonial dream, and heroic feat of progress set against industrial sunsets alert us that art and imagination can go awry. This was my third proposition, that we need to grapple with the destructive side of imagination and images as much as with the life-enhancing power of art, as indeed both speakers have. Jules Verne's journey from Balmain to the centre of the earth and back in time can also be seen as a good regression, as a search for the sacred, for the also irrational but real mundus imaginalis of the soul that Eastern mystics call the eighth climate. Art, I'm sure you need no convincing, can help transform first mindscapes and potentially landscapes. Thank you.
I did find what Uta had to say quite fascinating, and I loved the way you distilled papers with those 3 points. Thank you for that. I'm thinking about art and labour, and I actually, when you were talking, I was thinking about Noel Counihan's 1940s print of the miner, who seems to me to be kind of modelled on the dying slave motif. Would that be? I don't know, that's what I think of. I'm just thinking about the context, which is the colonial context, and the industrial context, which is the worker, the conditions of the worker as being the context in which that artist made that picture. He went specifically to a coal mine to study the miners in the 1940s. And I can't see a way out of the representation of sacrifice and death. I see that context as determining that as the manifestation that seemed most appropriate. And so maybe, so in that case, is your point that possibly the artist may have or could have found another expression that was much more in terms of an empowerment of the worker?
No, I was trying, should I respond directly? I was trying to suggest that the work of the labourer, which is largely extractive, but then there are all these follow-on industries, you know, that connected to coal, where you make things as well. This kind of making homo faber status of the worker should be put on an equal par, including skills, traditional knowledge, and so on and so forth, with that of the artist. See, this is the gap now that's raging in the Ruhr Valley. People are saying, we're being told we have culture, we're listed with UNESCO World Heritage, but we're not participating in art making. We're installed as consumers of our own life histories. So that's in a form of colonialism, of, you know, borrowing lives from others and working with them. So that's what I was trying to tease out. Is there any chance of, you know, tapping, like the craft movement might be an example, you know. We can all be makers in a benign sense, not just destroyers. As that's what I'm trying to put on the table as a hope.
And you're saying not victims.
The sacrificial dimension is very, very complicated. Yeah. You know, I can say maybe something about that later. Yeah.
Ian, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it was this working?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I thought it was very, very fertile. Very. I mean, the question of work and mining is very, very complex. I mean, it seemed to me that mining has often or largely heroized males. I mean, that was very clear in that. And, you know, George Orwell wrote this wonderful essay, Down the Mine. You probably know about it. And there's a whole, when I first used to work in working class radical history in Britain, there's a kind of enormous sentimental almost adoration of the coal miner. And of course, they became great victims in the 1970s with the Thatcher interventions. But I do remember reading a book by a young woman who grew up in a mining family, talking about the fact that nobody had mentioned that, you know, that the husband came home absolutely filthy every day. And the mother had to, you know, wash these clothes every single day in tubs and spend all these hours, and you know, sort of servicing this story. And then also, of course, mining was immensely dangerous. So you know, they could lose their husbands. So it just seemed to me that one of the things we've got to do, if we are engaging with the question of the fact that we're taking away the work of miners, is address it in a holistic way.
Just very quickly to that, you know, I took notes as I was listening again to your wonderful papers, you know, that I think also connects to another bridge one could try and make between the company that you emphasize, the idea of the company as shareholders, you know, so this pitching jobs against the environment is just so wrong, you know. So the company and the companionship of your trio, you know, can one forward a bridge towards these two as well. I think there's a lot of social work to be done to make these connections, not just across disciplines, not just between work and the object of labour or art, you know, but also this idea of a new social imaginary. Yeah.
Just one last instance, you know, one of the reasons that people are defending the Adani mine is that it will bring work. It will bring work, and this was bandied around as 10,000 jobs. The same mine is boasting that it will be the most automated mine in the world. It will be run almost entirely by robots, and in fact, the 10,000 jobs is a complete myth. The mine, the Adani one questioned in court, one of the key figures in Adani admitted that initially the jobs would be around about 1,400 before the mine came into full production, when of course they would probably dwindle to about 100. So mining is no longer going to be, I don't think, something about human beings being thrust into this difficult relationship, but it will be an automated process very largely. So it takes that out of the equation.
Thank you. Thank all three for a wonderful session. It's just a little art historical point, first of all, to Anne. It's not the dying slave, but I think you're right. There is a link to ancient imagery, and it's the wounded Gaul, which is a Roman sculpture in the Pinakothek in Munich. But so the wounded, there's also a dying Gaul, but the point is that those figures were men whose bodies had sort of been crumpled to the ground as victims of Roman imperial expansion, or as victims of the outmoded physical work of mining. I think what Ian said at the very end is crucial. These sort of humanist images of the mine and the men who were working in it will be a thing of the past, because the truth of mines in the future is mechanisation on an absolutely awe-inspiring scale. I mean, when you see the machinery of these giant open cut mines. But the only other point, remember, in some places, of course, mining still is tragically dangerous. China, in particular, the Chinese coal industry sees thousands die over the decades. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, in the history of mining, there has only been maybe 80 years of a history of regulated, unionised labour. I mean, if you take the lead mines of the 80s, I mean, they were sending 10-year-olds down to live and die there. I mean, mining has never really cared about the people doing the mining. I mean, it's a terrible... I mean, only in the height of union power was there organisation. I mean, mining has no history of looking after its own.
Just on that, obviously, the unions have taken the lead on campaigns around health and safety, and you just only have to think most recently about asbestosis and the role of unions in raising those concerns. But what I really wanted to raise was, throughout both of your papers, you referred to Indigenous histories, but of course it's actually been Indigenous activists who have raised some of the biggest challenges to the mining companies, from the court cases that went through in the 1970s. There was Kawata, there was, he was a Wick man. There's obviously, Mabo has implications, the whole question of land and control and who has the say, but also way up in the top end, the role of those communities in fighting, the whole anti-uranium movement of the 1970s. There's an extremely rich body of visual material, which is, activists, posters and banners and the like. And in a sense, you don't really have to go to an old social realist like Noel Kernahan to find a huge body of material that does address issues like the role of women, the role of Indigenous people, the questions of health and safety, the questions, that were put by Indigenous people about control over their land.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you for that. I have I was participated in a film in which we were doing cross-disciplinary work up on a plateau in Western Arnhem Land, and interviewing the last Indigenous man who grew up there. The plateau, which is the size of Belgium, had been vacated in the 1950s by Aboriginal people. And they were drawn into the tin mines. And it was a really interesting point that this guy, Lofty
Bardial.
Lofty Bardial, yes. His name was Bardial Mujammerik. And he was coughing as he was speaking. And he said, and I said, well, why did you guys stay out? You went to try the tin mines, and you found, he was telling how exploitative it was, how awful it was. Why did you not come back? And he said, tobacco. He said, we all became addicted to tobacco. There's no tobacco on the Western Arnhem Land Plateau. That's why we never came back. It's just one of the kind of strange byproducts of mining.
Any other responses to that? I mean, it does raise the question of art's role. I was saying in my introduction, where, because artists feel themselves very much activated by these issues. It's across a spectrum of art making. Artists have intervened in many ways to sort of draw attention and protest this. But, it might be worth also thinking about, I think, Uta, you were provoking us to think too about what kinds of labour, do we only value artistic labour once we've eradicated all the other forms of community and other kinds of, is art acceptable to, the mining companies? They're commissioning artists to go and take pictures of their the glories of their open-cut mines. Is something kind of missing in the middle that is more at a community level, or and that seems to be kind of a pertinent question to ask. There are I can see lots of hands up, so let's.
Thank you very much for your papers and for the response. I have a question from the point of view of someone who's been a tourist in Sydney and at the Great Reef Barrier for the past days. So those papers told us about stories of moments of battles between economic interests in mining and aesthetic concerns and care for pleasure of natural beauty. And what we see now from today's perspective is that, well, the coal mines of the Sydney Harbour have closed, and the mining projects on the reef are more or less avoided for the moment. And what's instead is another industry, in fact, tourist industry, right? And it's also providing jobs. It's also exploiting resources in another way. This industry needs to protect the landscape in a way, but maybe in a selective way too. So it's not economics against aesthetics, right? It's a form of economics against another form of economics, I guess. And so I'm wondering, and it absolutely follows up what Mark just said. I'm wondering about the role of artists and cultural activists in this situation. Are artists just working for the tourist industry, or are they doing something else?
Can I perhaps say something about that? So directly working with a community in Mission Beach, Mission Beach was knocked over by 2 cyclones in succession for 4 years apart. They rebuilt the whole community. And then an even more intensive cyclone, which is another consequence of climate change, way beyond the cyclone level that was seen as safe, came and eradicated the community again. And they brought me in to tell the story of John Buse, because he was at Mission Beach and he directed the campaign from there, both to save the forests and to save the reef. And what is interesting there is that we managed to persuade the Queensland Wildlife to give over Buste's house and grounds. It's a beautiful house and beautiful grounds to the community as an arts and environment centre. And they vowed to rebuild Mission Beach entirely around those 2 axes. And because everyone had been implicated in this enormous catastrophe, it broke down the barriers between, say, the tourist industries. And they vowed that they will, remains to see if they will. They will only do ecotourism. I think tourism is the least problem for the reef because for two reasons. One is the tourist industry needs to keep the reef pristine if they're going to keep attracting people. And secondly, it's only by getting people to the reef to be involved in it that you get people to defend it. Otherwise, it's far away from, from most of Australia or a lot of Australia, and if you're not engaged in it, you have no sympathisers to fight for it. So I think it's in a different category. You're quite right that they're both different forms of economic exploitation in a way, but I think it's in a different category to the extraction.
I know both Anne and Peter want to go first.
I'd like to, just on the reef, Ian, would you say it was the case that early tourism on the reef was actually quite destructive to the reef? And in the 1920s, I think it was the 1930s, that the Barrier Reef Protection Society was established to stop people chipping away the coral. So in fact, up to the 1930s, tourism was destructive in ways that people recognised. And then there was reef protection. Would that be right? Is that the chronology?
Not quite. It's nearly the chronology. The first tourism on the reef was ecotourism. You weren't allowed to go onto the reef unless you could prove that you were doing a scientific experiment or doing scientific work. So the very first tourists were actually kind of pseudo-science exercises where they claimed they were doing work. Do you remember this? Yes. And so the irony is that tourism began as ecotourism, where very small groups of people were being inducted into learning about the reef and having films shown to them and so on, and able to claim that they were part of a scientific exercise. And then you got the mass tourism, and that's the period. So really it's more like the 1950s that you get this business of huge influxes of people chipping away coral, absolutely, collecting the Triton shells, and Triton were the main predators of the starfish that are now destroying them. So you're absolutely right. I mean, it was a terrible period. But it is kind of ironic that it began as reef tourism and we're now fighting to get it back that way.
Just very briefly, I want to sort of support Sophie's point a little bit from at least an Indigenous perspective, perhaps. Yeah, I think there is a problem with turning the environment into a spectacle to be held only, and how it links up with tourism and industries that might be benign to a certain extent, but it's not all tourism, it's ecotourism. So in Central Australia, as we speak now, in the Western McDonnell Ranges, the Western Island country, where basically every track and cave and nook is a sacred site. It's history, it's not nature. It's the Taj Mahal for sure. The Tourist Commission wants to put in bicycle paths, like cross-country mountain biking things, for international tourism, winter Australian tourism and things like that. And it's sort of, it's not mining, it's not extracting, but it's a form of engagement that totally disregards the significance of the traditional owners of the place. So again, what I guess I'm trying to ask is, can we have a different, cosmology would be too big a term, I guess, but a different subject-object relationship between ourselves, our cultural imaginary, and this land?
That's a very big question. I know there were some others out yes, over there.
I just want to take up Anne's point and ask Ian in regard to Judith Wright, because she was, very friendly with people like Kath Walker. Yes. And Margaret Coombs was deeply involved in Indigenous issues. So I was just wondering, in terms of this fight on the reef, you mentioned the forester, the artist, and someone else. Was there a larger coalition? I know Kath Walker was very involved in environmental fights, with Judith as well. So I'm just wondering, is there an Indigenous story in there as well?
There is an Indigenous story about it. I mean, the Indigenous story of the reef is actually tragic. I mean, you know, because of the all along the edges of the reef were small clan communities that were then bundled together into missions, and in that bundling them together, scrambling them together, their languages were lost and their histories were lost. Many of these people were exploited on the islands, and so places like Palm Island became have been terrible places. Conversely, there were a lot of Aboriginal people getting involved in exercising their rights against the reef. You're quite right about Kath Walker. She's a very important person involved in Judith rights activism, but also in places like, especially around Cooktown, where there has been an Indigenous movement at Hopevale for a long time, trying to resist both the effects of the gold miners around there, and then also, of course, of Cook himself. So that there is a very important story, and I have tried to engage with it in the book I've written on the reef. But there's a lot more that needs to be done about it, and you're quite right. It cries out for a special work on that.
My question is kind of more inspired by your papers. Leads me to, you know, I'm thinking about mining in terms of questions of visibility, and both of your papers are thinking about spaces that are not necessarily on the surface, you know, and mining, of course, more and more is about going further and further underneath visible spaces, you know, deep sea, drilling and fracking are all these more automated processes where actually you cannot see where those resources are until they're extracted and above ground. So unlike earlier mining practices where, you know, you could bring the camera down into the pits or into the tunnels and so on. So I wonder if there's with the sort of technological advancement of mining, whether the visual is not the way to engage, or is the visual failing us in terms of, you know, a kind of eco-critical response?
Anyone have some?
In terms of deep
Could you use your mic? Sorry,
in terms of deep sea mining, yes, I'm not. I haven't given that a lot of thought, but you're absolutely right that the whole of the harbour, in terms of thinking about the mine, the coal mine under the harbour, excited people's imaginations in a visual way. How could it have excited their imaginations, say, through the sense of sound? How could it have done it through the sense of touch or another kind of sense? I'm not sure. Have you had any experience of, say, the importance of sound in terms of contemporary mining? I'm sure there must be something about it. But I don't know. You know,
I mean, it's a larger question of what form of culture or what form of human creativity might be the best deployed. I mean, you know, because you could argue that there are wide swathes of popular culture which may derive from sort of artistic sort of input. I mean, imagine, okay, this is a really ridiculous thing to say, but in The Matrix, there is that famous, well, when we cut away to see what really is at the heart of The Matrix, it's the farming of humans because, you know, electricity is powered by their real bodies being, and if you looked at the kind of way that that's laid out, that sort of shocking and incredibly popular culture diffused image, which sort of divorced real life from sort of some terrible organic farming going on of human beings, was incredibly powerful. And you could argue that Avatar with all its weirdnesses, provided certain templates, certain eco-templates. I mean, for all James Cameron's problems, it nevertheless was a kind. There is a direct line between the Lorax, which of course lies on the floor when he first goes to the school, and that, in other words, there's a swathe of popular culture that is not, let's call it high art, but which uses an imaginary which has been created by the very kind of visual images that the bank of artistic images is being redeployed by those who want it. So in a way, I think I'm arguing for the deep effectiveness of visuality in it, but I'm not sure.
Could I say something about that? Because that's one of the reasons I believe, one of the reasons that environmental art is such an important, and it has achieved an importance in the environmental struggle that is exceptional. And it's partly because, take acidification of the ocean. Not only is it an invisible process, because it's completely chemical, it's stealthy, long, and scientists have had a real problem trying to get across the dangers of acidification. In fact, they've failed altogether. People hardly know anything about it. When I had 50 interviews after my book on the reef, not one person asked me about acidification. But I have seen 2 or 3 fantastic artistic attempts to make the invisible process visible. It's one of the things that artists can do. It's one of the reasons why I find, when we're trying to get together different disciplines, that the science people are really avid to connect with artists because of their capacity to transform things that are not actually tangible in a literal sense, in a material sense, for them to find ways through their creativity of conveying that.
I'm just thinking about your question in terms of art practice today, the harbour, not mining, but the harbour and the invisibility of the underneath of the harbour. There are artists who are working with bringing the sounds of the harbour into public listening space as a way of, I guess, drawing attention to the idea that, in fact, the underwater is a space of sound, not a space of looking, so that the animals of the underwater, and it's more about an eco-turn to the animal, or what's called the animal sometimes, or to more than human, and trying to, I guess, stimulate an eco-sensibility in human beings by getting away from the visual, the human-centred visual emphasis, and exploring that oral realm that, say, fish and mammals under the water live by. And so there is a fantastic artist in Sydney at the moment called Mark Brown, and I think you'll find he'll have a work in Science Week, which you won't be here for, but he's going to bring the sounds of Sydney Harbour out from the underneath into the Maritime Museum so people can hear what's there. I think that might be an example, but it's not related to mining.
And what really struck me about your paper was how stupid from an economic point of view that mine was, given there's just so much coal north and south of Sydney that's easily got at. So it struck me that, and which is what I think you were sort of arguing, was that what were the people who, or the directors, or whoever's idea it was, were they actually driven by their imagination, by reading Jules Verne, by wanting to conquer the world rather than make money? Was that, do you think, the driving motive of it, when they could have just gone to Wollongong and just lying there wanting to get?
That's so right. the conceit of being able to do it seems to have been a major driver in this. So from about the 1860s, as far as I can ascertain, there were all sorts of consultants trying to decide whether there was coal under Sydney. The reasons given were economic, that if there was coal under Sydney, then they wouldn't have to bring coal from Newcastle here to Sydney, and it would also, this is a good one, it would also make Sydney, it would give Sydney the edge over Melbourne in terms of economic, in terms of an economic centre. But how can you disassociate the impact of Jules Verne and the imagination from that idea? I don't think it's possible. I think that the will to achieve it at whatever cost was driven by the imagination. Absolutely.
I mean, I think there was a train line going to Newcastle and Wollongong by then. Anyway, and I suppose what I was getting at was that, in fact, what was driving them was something more akin to art than to economics.
Yes.
A sort of aesthetic type, seizing or something.
Please reply to that. And then
Just quickly, because I think it connects also back to what Maggie was saying about what's this desire to look, to see underneath. Like the scopophilic drive, in a sense, maybe what you shouldn't be seeing, but can be a witness to. But Anne has emphasised, I think, very convincingly, it's this also will to control what can't perhaps be controlled. And to me, it's impossible not to think of the unconscious when I think of descent, the ocean, even deeper, back in time, Jules Verne, centre of the earth. So. This is what David Tacey argues, as Australia has got some difficulty in letting go of this totally controlling of everything, and in the process sacrificing all its potential imagination that can be transformative rather than just taking it out and clearing it out and,
Do you think that's why mining companies, I should say, like sublime photographs of their mines? They're always sort of like at sunset.
I tried to show
this sort of sublime aesthetic seems to sort of drive it. So there's a sort of almost a religious thing, driving it.
We have another question for that.
I think that's a really interesting point because even when you go back to 19th century Australian explorers, for instance, the fossil discoveries made at the Wellington Caves, I think artists and scientists who went on those expeditions were, going along with the whole idea of empire's progress, and, miners went with those guys because they got into the caves and they were often difficult to get into. They were mostly not paid on those expeditions, so, the issue of where the workers stood there. But also they just went into these caves and, took their hammers and gouged out huge chunks of osseous breccia and fossil material and sent it back to England and Europe. And so I guess, as artists and scientists, we have been culpable in that whole, progress at all costs. And it is underpinned, I think, by a sort of sublime aesthetic, a sort of a Kantian aesthetic of, having the moral high ground, that this is for the greater good. And so what we do to the environment, how we deal with the landscape, how we deal with Indigenous presence and ownership is all bound up in that. So I guess we have to acknowledge our own part in the history of that, but also our very strong and positive part in hopefully a solution and a way of thinking of ourselves differently.
Thank you. There is another interesting aspect to this, in that the 19th century, I think I'm right, is the first, or at least this is the way the newspapers represented it, the first century for geology to make an impression. And so that drive, that thing about geology, deep time, the sublime, the unrepresentable, I think this had a power because the geologists were employed by the companies. As certainly for the coal mining company in Sydney, the geologists were brought out from Wales because they were coal experts, and they were employed not only at Sydney University but also by the coal mining company. So there are a whole lot of different discourses all overlapping, one of which is definitely aesthetic, and I think Ian's point is really important there. The sublime plays a huge part in this, but it can also come from literature.
Yes, I think Charles Darwin wouldn't have produced his theory without the geologists, and I think Alexander von Humboldt was employed by mining companies too.
So we maybe have time for one brief question to end our session.
So this is maybe a comment to Anne, and maybe via Maggie's question here about 19th century mining techniques, and all of you have been talking about the sublime and I think these subtropic relations, but I wanted to inject more of maybe a technical engineering perspective, which is that in the 19th century, caissons were used actually to send workers down into very deep areas with water and without water, right? So you have the Brooklyn Bridge in the United States, for example, and other kind of areas like Sydney Harbor, Sydney Bridge, and workers would not be able to see what they were doing necessarily. They were put into the box with enough food, water, and air that was calculated to actually get them to a certain sea level. So I find that kind of technology pretty fascinating because it had nothing to do with how deep, how large the ravine they were being put in, the structure they were building. It was purely on an individual basis. Could they survive the work shift that they were given, and then could they make it back up to the surface? So there's nothing to do with sight, only purely to do with survival. End on that.
Right, on that gloomy note, have we got enough oxygen, coffee and lunch to survive? But first, please join me in thanking our panellists. Thank you very much.